There is not a single reason for North Koreans to fight and die for Putin. That's what Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky wrote on X, formerly Twitter, on December 16, 2024. And yet North Koreans fighting for Russia and President Vladimir Putin seem to be dropping like flies in the Kursk Oblast. And there are many reasons for this, but not the kind Zelensky was referring to. No, these are far more tangible and far more disastrous. A lack of proper training leaves the North Korean troops unprepared. Their inexperience on the battlefield shows in every misstep. The language barrier only compounds the chaos, turning even basic commands into confusion. But above all, it's their catastrophically bad tactics, so flawed they practically guarantee failure, that are driving these staggering losses. So let's break down exactly what's going wrong on the ground, focusing on the tactics that are making the North Koreans nothing more than sitting ducks in a war they should have never been involved in. To understand just how dire the situation in Kursk is, we need to look at the shocking casualties first. Casualties that are turning the Russo-Ukrainian war into a death trap for the North Koreans. By December 16th, the first major reports began to surface regarding North Korean soldiers fighting and dying in Kursk. Zelensky confirmed that North Korean troops had been involved in combat operations in the region and the toll was already severe. This early confirmation marked the beginning of a brutal and deadly chapter for the North Koreans in Kursk. White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby further confirmed the North Korean casualties, stating that the North Korean soldiers had moved from secondary positions to the front lines in recent days. While no specific casualty numbers were initially provided, the severity of the situation became clear as reports continued to emerge from the front lines. By December 23rd, it was confirmed that over 3,000 North Korean troops had either been killed or wounded in the Kursk Oblast. That's a quarter of the total 12,000 North Korean soldiers deployed to the region. The reports coming from South Korea were a little more conservative but disastrous nonetheless. The South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff stated that at least 1,100 North Korean soldiers had been killed or wounded by that point. Though the figures differ, both sources agreed on one thing: the casualties are mounting at an alarming rate, and there's no clear end in sight. The confirmation of this came only a few days later, on December 27th, when Kirby stated that the North Korean forces suffered roughly 1,000 casualties in a single week. And yet North Korea is showing no signs of backing down. In fact, reports suggest that Kim Jong Un, the country's supreme leader, is planning to send more troops to Russia. This shocking fact begs the question, why? Why would Kim, in the face of overwhelming losses, continue to send more troops, knowing full well the fate that awaits them? The answer is simple: greed. Because who cares about human lives when there's so much to gain? Every dead North Korean soldier is a small price to pay for the rewards Kim is reaping from Russia's President Vladimir Putin. First, there's oil. Since March 2024, Russia has supplied North Korea with over 1 million barrels of oil, double the annual cap imposed by international sanctions. Then there's the military technology. Russia's more than happy to throw some goodies to sweeten the deal. In exchange for troops and weapons, North Korea is receiving air defense systems and the know-how to launch its spy satellites. What's more, satellite imagery shows that North Korea is expanding its missile production facilities, specifically making advancements on its KN-23 and KN-24 ballistic missiles. But it doesn't stop there. North Korea has also been promised fighter jets like MiG-29s and Su-27s. That's right, Russia handing over advanced aircraft that will vastly improve North Korea's air capabilities. Of course, North Korea is also improving Russia's military capabilities, supplying the country with a steady stream of artillery and mortar shells. Believe it or not, as much as 60% of Russia's munitions are currently coming from North Korea. Even more shockingly, North Korea is now sending newer, more advanced weapons, like the 240mm multiple launch rocket systems equipped with cutting-edge guidance systems. But all of this comes at a price. According to experts, Russia could be paying up to $572 million every year just to keep North Korean troops on the front lines. As for the weapons, they could have earned Kim up to $5.5 billion since the start of the invasion. That's quite a hefty sum for any country, let alone a regime as cash-strapped as North Korea. So what if Kim's troops are slaughtered in Kursk? He's getting a deal that's more than worth it: cash, oil, and weapons that keep his regime stable and strong. So to him, it's business as usual. Of course, if even a fraction of the millions Kim is raking in was spent on properly training and equipping his troops for the realities of modern warfare, their fate in Russia wouldn't be so disastrous. With the right preparation, they wouldn't be cannon fodder, blindly marching to their deaths. But that's exactly what North Korean troops are in Russia, and their outdated tactics are mostly to blame. The tactic that cost North Koreans and Russians the most is undoubtedly the so-called meat grinder tactic. This tactic served the North Korean troops poorly in the Korean War, and it's serving them even worse now in Russia. The tactic relies on sheer numbers of infantry advancing in waves, hoping to break through Ukrainian defenses simply by overwhelming them. But the tragic reality of this strategy is that it wastes lives and achieves little more than carnage. After all, this approach is painfully obsolete in the face of modern warfare. It essentially has North Korean troops running through open fields in massive groups without armored support. And those open fields, they are ripe for Ukrainian drones and artillery. So this tactic makes North Korean troops nothing more than targets, easily mowed down by precision strikes. Oftentimes, they can't even get close to their target, let alone breach the defenses. This outright stupid tactic has been deployed by the North Koreans throughout their December attacks. In mid-December, these troops participated in an assault near Kruglenko, a village in the Kursk Oblast. This assault was part of a joint Russian offensive to capture key positions in the region. The plan was to secure the forests that would allow further advancements toward Malaya Loknaya, a village captured by Ukrainian forces as part of their Kursk incursion. However, as history has repeatedly shown, the meat grinder tactic had disastrous consequences. The initial assault, comprised mostly of North Korean infantry, ended in failure, as the troops were devastated by Ukrainian drones and artillery. Though they managed to establish a foothold in the forest, the toll was staggering, which begs the question, was the slight territorial gain worth the bloodshed? In the aftermath of these heavy losses, Russian commanders attempted to shift the focus of the assault, directing the North Koreans to another area of the Kursk salient. But once again, the same ineffective tactics played out. Even with the change in direction, North Korean forces were sent into the same open fields, with their infantry once again picked apart by Ukrainian artillery and drones. So despite some moments of territorial gain, these assaults ended in slaughter as well, with North Korean forces once again failing to achieve any lasting strategic success. Of course, this approach is by no means new to the Russian forces. Putin has long relied on sending troops in open fields without support, accepting heavy losses to achieve minor, temporary advantages. It just seems that now he has found new cannon fodder, the North Koreans. With their historical experience of mass infantry assaults, they fit right into this horrific approach. However, the consequences of the meat grinder tactic were only made worse by another useless tactic, or better yet, a lack of a tactic. You see, the North Koreans have been failing to properly hide themselves during their advances. While attempting to build up forces in wooded areas and launch concentrated counterattacks, they neglected the basic principles of camouflage and concealment. Although, truthfully, they might not be familiar with these principles in the first place. That's how poor their training and combat experience is. The Ukrainian forces have already witnessed just how poorly prepared the North Koreans are for modern combat based on their reaction to drones. Instead of freezing or taking cover, as more experienced Russians have been trained to do, North Korean soldiers tend to panic and run when they see or hear a drone approaching. This reaction directly exposes them to further attack, making them easy targets for precision strikes. Their instinct to flee when faced with the presence of a drone betrays a lack of discipline and proper training, which could have otherwise taught them the value of remaining still. Without proper concealment tactics, the North Korean troops were left exposed to devastating Ukrainian strikes, transforming their massed forces into easy targets. Ukrainians have even used HIMARS cluster munitions to take the North Koreans out as they were approaching. The narrow terrain didn't exactly help either, leaving the North Korean troops bunched up and helpless in the face of the onslaught. But this is exactly what the Ukrainian forces wanted. You see, these forces actually have smart tactics, unlike their enemies in the Russo-Ukrainian war. In one instance, the Ukrainian troops withdrew from their positions in the forest, creating a vacuum that the advancing North Koreans inevitably filled. But as soon as they moved in, the Ukrainian forces used drones to relay their coordinates for HIMARS rocket systems, which unleashed cluster munitions on the tightly packed North Korean assault units. The result was devastating. The valley quickly became a kill zone, and the North Korean advance was decisively crushed. The failure to properly conceal their positions and plan for modern combat scenarios led to not only a failed assault, but also unnecessary deaths. The lack of tactical discipline, paired with poor decision-making, left the North Korean troops vulnerable in a way that could have been avoided with basic military strategy. Seeing that Ukrainian precision attacks were taking out swarms of soldiers, the North Koreans attempted another foolish tactic. They started using their own soldiers as human bait. That's right, they send their soldiers directly to their deaths in an effort to distract Ukrainian drone operators. Usually, a single soldier would serve as the live bait. At the same time, other soldiers in the unit were waiting for Ukrainian drones to target the bait to shoot them down. Unsurprisingly, this tactic led to another catastrophic result. Simply put, the Ukrainian drone operators didn't fall for this tactic. Not only that, but they also quickly identified the concentrated positions of the North Korean troops waiting nearby. They were then targeted by precision strikes, and the survivors, well, they were hunted down by more drones, bringing a swift and brutal end to their misguided tactics. Ultimately, the human bait tactic proved to be nothing more than a costly exercise in futility. The North Korean attempts to sacrifice soldiers to distract drones only led to massive casualties and failed assaults. And as if that wasn't enough, North Korean troops also showed a complete disregard for their wounded. Even worse, this doesn't appear to be a result of poor planning or simple oversight. It's rather a deeply ingrained tactical mindset rooted in outdated military practices. Reports from Ukrainian soldiers on the ground have consistently highlighted this disturbing behavior. One harrowing report detailed a first-person view or FPV drone strike that hit a group of 3 North Korean soldiers, knocking 2 down. Despite clear signs of life, the third soldier showed no urgency to assist or call for help. Instead, he stood still for a moment, observing the fallen, before moving forward as if the casualties were nothing more than a minor setback. In another instance, shells exploded just a few feet away from North Korean soldiers, yet they continued to move forward without reacting or acknowledging the danger they had just faced. This chilling indifference to the well-being of their comrades, and even themselves, highlights not only the brutality of their tactics, but also the deep disregard for human life that seems to pervade the North Korean military culture. But then again, they aren't alone in this. The North Korean approach reflects similar strategies employed by Russian forces, who have also been criticized for their lack of care for the injured. This approach allowed North Korean troops to make some significant advances in Kursk. Even as North Korean assault groups suffered heavy casualties, they continued to push forward under massive fire support from Russian units and the influence of electronic warfare against Ukrainian drones. Despite being hit by precision strikes and shelling, the North Korean infantry remained relentless, yet completely ignorant of the heavy losses they were sustaining. According to Ukrainian military blogger Yuri Butasov, no evacuation of the wounded or dead was carried out during these assaults, adding further to the inhumane nature of their strategy. Given these circumstances, it isn't surprising that footage from the battlefield often shows piles of North Korean bodies lying just where they fell, abandoned by their comrades. It's one thing for the regime to treat its soldiers as expendable, but it's another when your own comrades fail to even attempt to aid you, leaving you to die alone on the battlefield. This brutal disregard for the wounded reflects a breakdown not only in the North Korean military strategy, but in the very sense of camaraderie and brotherhood that typically holds a fighting force together. This tactic, as well as all other tactics employed by North Koreans in Kursk, ultimately failed to deliver the desired results. The only thing they did manage to achieve was to leave a trail of death and suffering in their wake. However, as mentioned at the beginning of the video, the high death toll can't be entirely blamed on poor North Korean military tactics, not when essentially everything is working against these troops in Russia. The first glaring issue here is the rudimentary training the North Korean soldiers received before being thrown into the fray. With time and resources in short supply, these troops were given only the barest understanding of modern warfare. And who was in charge of training them, you ask? The Russian airborne forces and marine brigades, units that had themselves been battered by months of heavy losses and numerous failed assaults. To make matters worse, many of their seasoned instructions were either dead or incapacitated, leaving the North Koreans to learn under the guidance of troops who had already been through hell themselves. So it's no surprise that these recruits were hopelessly unprepared for the complexities of contemporary warfare. For those curious about the specifics, the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade was reportedly involved in training the North Korean soldiers in the Kursk Oblast. This brigade doesn't exactly have the best reputation, and that's putting it lightly. In 2023, it was embroiled in scandal after it was revealed that its personnel were deliberately using chemical weapons in Ukraine, a blatant violation of international law. So they aren't exactly the dream instructors for soldiers in need of quality training, are they? But this lack of proper training wasn't just theoretical. We saw it on the battlefield, when North Korean soldiers became exhausted from walking across open fields and, under fire, sat down to rest. Yeah, you heard that right. It's not like they have anything to fear in an open field during a war, but alas, no one had taught them to expect the kind of ferocious attrition they'd face in modern combat. Then there's the language barrier issue, which created further chaos in North Korean coordination with Russian forces. Reports from the front lines suggest that communication was almost non-existent between the two groups. In some cases, even friendly fire incidents occurred, including a disastrous moment where North Korean forces fired on Russian Akhmat battalion vehicles, leading to the deaths of 8 Chechen soldiers. Though this was a tragic misstep, it wasn't entirely unexpected. After all, you've got two forces trying to work together who are unable to understand one another. That's a disaster just waiting to happen. And let's not forget the winter conditions, which exacerbate every single issue. When the terrain is covered in snow and ice, movement becomes a struggle. But for the North Koreans, it wasn't just the weather that was a challenge. It was their complete lack of equipment and preparation. They weren't ready for the bitter cold, and it made their positions even more conspicuous to Ukrainian forces, who had no trouble picking them off one by one. In the end, it's clear. When you combine inferior tactics, poor training, a lack of equipment, and disastrous coordination, you end up with high casualties. And the North Koreans learned this lesson the hard way. A tragedy, yes, but a predictable one. But where are the Russians in all of this? What are they doing about these disastrous North Korean losses? If you were to ask Putin this question, you would probably get a question back. What North Koreans? Yeah, the Russians are going to great lengths to hide the fact that North Korean forces are even in Russia. And let us tell you, they're pulling out all the stops. Zelensky even revealed that Russian forces have been burning the faces of fallen North Korean soldiers to cover up their identities. It's a cloak and dagger operation, with the dagger being put into the North Koreans' backs. The Kremlin is also making sure that no North Korean faces are visible while training on Russian soil. And when this fails, they reportedly attempt to destroy video footage showing North Korean soldiers in action. If you can't hide the troops, hide the evidence, right? What's more, even Putin himself seems so deeply embarrassed by the whole situation. Despite his open relations with North Korea, the Russian president made a point of not mentioning North Korean troops during his annual direct line press conference in December. And this press conference lasted for 4.5 hours. The question remains, is Putin embarrassed by using foreign troops in general, or is it specifically the incompetent North Koreans that are causing him discomfort? Feel free to share your answer to this question in the comments section below. And while you're doing that, think about this. Are the absurd tactics employed by the brainwashed North Korean troops the true cause of their catastrophic losses? And how much longer can this madness continue? We look forward to hearing your analysis of the situation.